Good afternoon and welcome to the DMA. Yay, great crowd here. Okay, I am Sue Canterbury. I'm the Pauline Gill Sullivan Curator of American Art and also co-curator of Frida Beyond the Myth. And before I go any further, please take a moment to silence your phones. You don't want to be that person. So just take a moment to take care of that. Thank you. In the wake of Frida Kahlo's death in 1954, fascination with the artist and her work underwent an exponential growth that ultimately eclipsed the fame and accomplishments of her contemporaries in Mexico, including that of her husband, Diego Rivera. Her small, intimate works were relatable, and they plumbed the depths of her pain, both psychological and physical, but a coded visual language that presented like riddles, begging for interpretation. Thus, Kahlo, the individual, has remained obscured, masked behind the persona she fashioned for public consumption. This afternoon's speaker, Dr. Salomon Grimberg, is probably one of the best guides to help us to enter Frida Kahlo's world and to expose some of the aspects of this complex individual who is rarely forthcoming and frequently misleading to those outside her most intimate circle of friends. Dr. Grimberg has long led a double life, practicing for 43 years as a psychologist with a specialization in childhood development, working at UT Southwestern Medical School, including as the director of psychiatric inpatient services, and also as the resident training director at Presbyterian Hospital of Dallas. After going into private practice, he was also on the clinical faculty at UT Southwestern before his retirement in 2019. That was his day job. On a parallel track, as a young man in Mexico City, he became exposed to Mexican modern and surrealist art and spent considerable time seeing exemplary works by major artists while working with the famed gallerist dealer Inés Zamora at the Galeria de Arte Mexicano in Mexico City. His fascination with artists' creative processes from a psychological perspective was a perfect fit for tilling such fertile ground. And he has published extensively about artists such as Lola Alvarez Bravo, Gunta Gerso, Remedios Varo, and Leonora Carrington, just to mention a few, and I mean just a few. Over 25 years, he has curated 15 museum exhibitions in Germany, Italy, Spain, Turkey, Mexico, and the United States, including here at the DMA. His publications of books, essays, and articles alone total 14 pages of his 32-page curriculum vitae. So I won't read all those to you. I'm sure you're relieved. Most pertinent for us today, though, is his work on Frida Kahlo. He is the author of numerous publications on the artist, including a catalog raisonné of her complete works, another book devoted to her richly symbolic still lifes, and Kahlo's relationship with the photographer Nicholas Murray, I Will Never Forget You. And finally, a book titled Song of Myself, which scrutinized Kahlo's medical records and their conflict with reality. Thus, I can say without reservation that we are in good hands this afternoon. Dr. Grimberg's lecture today is Frida Kahlo, Reconsidered. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Salomon Grimberg to the podium.
Hello. Thank you. Frida Kahlo painted the self-portrait with a portrait of Dr. Faril in 1951, 3 years before she died. The brushes dripping blood and the heart on the palette is telling us that she painted the portrait with the blood of her heart. On the left, we have a page from her diary from the year in which her leg was amputated. On the bottom it reads, "Feet, what do I need them for if I have wings to fly?" She's actually paraphrasing Saint Teresa of Avila, because in her autobiography, St. Teresa questions a butterfly and says, how can it be walking step by step if it has wings to fly? Sometimes I wonder, I think information is alive and floating somewhere in space, and sometimes it has a way of entering us when we least expect it, and we let go of it, or rather it lets us let go of it in certain ways. I say this because I think the self-portrait is prophetic. Why would she paint it 3 years before she died? It was the last portrait that she signed and dated. What about that gap? Actually, there is not another self-portrait following this one that is signed. I think it's prophetic because she paints herself after the amputation. She's sitting in her wheelchair next to the physician who did the surgery. She's wearing her huipil from Yalalag, the same one that she wore on her deathbed, and the same one that she wore while she was wheeled in to the crematorium. She told Giselle Freund, if my leg gets cut off, I'm going to kill myself. Frida felt this confusion, and when she reflected on her life, she thought that her life made no sense to her. And she applied that idea of not making sense to her painting. She was an insecure child. She thought of herself ugly. She believed her half-sister who told her she was neither the child of her parents, and she believed that and assumed that's why her parents loved her sisters more than they loved her. At age 7, she suffered from polio, which left her with a shorter, thinner, weaker leg. At 18, she was in a tram accident coming back from school with her boyfriend. The tram was hit by a bus, and the rest is she lived the rest of her life with a map of some 30 surgeries. At 22, she married infamous philanderer and famous muralist Diego Rivera. She married him twice. The first time was not enough. And again to Giselle Freund, she said, I've had 2 accidents in my life. In one was the tram accident. The second one was Diego. This confusion, she wanted to know where it came from. And she used, excuse me, and this confusion, she portrays in her self-portrait as a wounded stag. Why did she choose the stag as her alter ego? Because in the native anatomy of divine influences, which was the pre-Hispanic equivalent of our horoscope, different animals ruled different parts of the body. And if you notice, the right foot is ruled by the deer. So she assumed that's what happened. Also, to be born on 9 deer was bad news. It foretold a bad future. Frida is alone. She's in the forest. She's been wounded and doesn't know where to go with this. So the deer is the incarnation of the god Tlaloc, the god of rain and lightning, which is warning us, which is warning us at the vanishing point of the painting. She gave Diego Rivera a photograph. In the verso it reads, "I'm just a poor little deer." And that's the first line of a popular Mexican song from Oaxaca from 1930. And it reads, I was a poor little deer, too shy to come down to get water during the day, but at night I come down and fall into the arms of my lover. Frida Kahlo, that she could make no sense of her life. And we ask ourselves, why would she focus on number 9? We've got 9 trees, we have 9 arrows, we have 9 points to the antlers. Well, because 9 was the number of stages in hell. On the 4th stage, Tlacalistli, one was repeatedly shot with arrows. She thought she was stuck there. And the 9 points is another 9. 3 times 9 is 27. 7 and 2 is 8. What do the points mean? The points are renewed, which means rebirth. She's telling us with one word at the bottom left of the painting, karma. She's telling us she's stuck to be reborn again and again. Karma is a Sanskrit word that means deed. It means that in our lives, our good deeds and our bad deeds are accumulated. And when we die, if we have done more bad deeds than good ones, we will be reborn again to suffer. So she assumed that the reason why she was suffering so much is because she had done many bad deeds in a previous life. The branch in Christianity is like a passport to enter heaven. It will come to life. She's not able to pick it up. Therefore, she confirms that she's stuck in the reincarnation cycle. Frida Kahlo was the 4th of 5 children of the Kahlo marriage. The child before her had died. He was the only son. The mother became depressed. She had postpartum depression and immediately got pregnant again. These mothers who oftentimes get pregnant after they lose a child is because they would like to replace the child that they lost. Needless to say, this child is never replaced, and the mothers look at the child differently than they look at other children. We have other artists who were replacement children, artists like Van Gogh or Salvador Dali. As they were growing up, the parents would take them to the cemetery, and they would see the tombs with their own names written on them, and that's how they grew up. And these people, needless to say, had conflicts with their parents because of it. Frida Kahlo it appears that her problems really began before she was born, because she was not wanted. She was a replacement child, and her mother became so depressed she could not breastfeed her. She got a nanny, nursemaid, to take care of that, and the nanny eventually was fired because she was drinking alcohol. She got a second nanny, and when the nanny finished breastfeeding her, the mother was pregnant once again, and of course self-absorbed, unable to take care of her. What this tells us is that Frida had a failure of bonding. And that explains many of the symptoms that she had later in life, like her clinginess, her dependency, her neediness, and of course, her separation anxiety. Here she is, dressed as a boy. This is her mother. This is her sister Adriana, her sister Matilde. This is Matilde's husband, and the father took the photograph. This is her younger sister, Cristina. If you look closely, this photograph taken when she was 18 years old, following the accident, what do you notice about it? She's hiding her right leg, because that's a leg that is thinner and withered. If you notice, here she's with her friends. That's her sister, Isabel Campos, and her. And what is she doing? She's hiding her thinner leg. She wore double socks It didn't really help her. Children made fun of her. They called her Frida Pegleg, Frida the Gimp. And as a child, she was going to be in a play by Maeterlinck, The Bluebird. And she overheard one of the teachers say, "Look at that girl's leg. We need to do something to hide it." And that's when she began to use long dresses. And when she decided to paint this painting, she was supposed to be a bluebird, but she said, "They only gave me strong wings and I couldn't get anywhere." At 18, coming back from school with her boyfriend, she was in a tram accident. A bus hit it, and she was propelled to the front of the bus, broke her withered leg, her back was broken, her pelvis was broken, her right arm was broken, and a steel bar pierced her back and emerged through her vagina. While she was at the Red Cross, her boyfriend was supposed to be with her, but he didn't. Instead, he went to Europe with his uncle because nothing had happened to him, just like so much had happened to her. From Europe, however, he sent her the first art books that she was interested in. And from the art books, she learned something which she applied for the rest of her life. She began her visual education. From Berlin, her boyfriend wrote to her that he'd seen a Venus by Botticelli. He'd fallen madly in love with her. He described it. She was this beautiful Venus pudica with a dark background. So Frida decided to paint this first self-portrait. But as you can tell, she's anything but pudica. On the contrary, in a Mexican Catholic country from 1926, to paint herself with a low cut, where you can see the silhouettes of her breasts, which are actually very similar to the breast of the Venus, and her knowing look, you know what she wants. Now, the mystery of the painting, however, is the right arm. What is it doing there? Well, people who don't know assume or project all sorts of interpretations. What happened was this: when she leaves the Red Cross and finishes the painting, she writes a birth certificate, as if instead of having gone to the Red Cross to get her surgeries for her back, her body, she is at the Red Cross to have a baby. So she does this birth certificate. The baby's name is Leonardo. Now, in order to paint this portrait, she's influenced by Mexican painting from the late 19th century, early 20th century, by Estrada, by Salomon. And these painters, you would go to them, you would ask them to do a portrait, and they would have these pad compositions. The only thing that would change, of course, would be the face of the sitter. And one of these pad compositions, of course, was the mother and the child. And what Frida does, of course, she removes the child. And that's the reason for the arm, and that's the reason for the mystery of the painting. In 1929, she marries Diego Rivera, and almost immediately they go to Cuernavaca, where he has a commission to paint a mural on the Palace of Cortés. And Frida, of course, has severe separation anxiety. She talks about crying all the time. I'm not quite sure why, because she was less than an hour away from Mexico City. She could have taken the bus any time, but she chose to stay, perhaps because Diego had an assistant called Ione Robinson, and Frida thought that Ione and Diego were starting something, some kind of and that was the first supposedly affair that he may have had. Soon after Diego paints this mural, he gets a commission to go to California to paint the Stock Exchange and 2 other murals. And there, Albert Bender asked Frida to do a commission. He says, "I would like to have a double portrait of you and Diego." And Frida paints this portrait. To look at it, it looks just like a simple portrait. However, Frida's visual education comes to the forefront. At that time, she was pregnant, and she very much wanted to have a child. But Diego Rivera did not want one. He said, "Babies cry too much, they bother, and I need my time." And what Frida wanted, though, is to be blessed by God, wanted the marriage to be blessed by God. But mentioning God to Diego Rivera was like a curse. In 1947, when he did his mural, A Dream, a Sunday Dream in the Alameda, he wrote on an unfurled scroll, God does not exist. Needless to say, you can imagine what happened. People came, vandalized the mural, etc. So for Frida to say that she believed in God was a no-no. She would never contradict him because she was always struggling, afraid that he would leave her. He was never going to leave her, but it was a nice thread to control her. So Frida wants to be blessed by God, and what she does, she copies. She uses as a model the Arnold Fini portrait. Arnold Fini by Van Eyck. At the time, this was Giovanni Cenami and Giovanna Cenami. They had just gotten married, and they wanted a witness to the marriage. Why? Because they wanted a child, and she was not getting pregnant. If you notice, there are elements that talk about the relationship. Of course, the matrimonial bed. She appears to be pregnant. She loyally gives her hand to him, and he's saluting her. And I keep pushing the wrong button, sorry. And in the background, what you see is this concave mirror with 12 miniatures. Each of the miniatures tells a passage from Christ's Passion. And the lamp above has only one candle. That candle represents God. He's watching over. And on the mirror, you see the painter, who is also a witness of the marriage. Now, where does Van Eyck get the idea? Well, it appears at the bottom of Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights. If you see, Adam has just woken up. Christ is bringing him Eve, his companion, and of course, he's blessing the union between them. Following the murals that he did in California, he goes to Detroit, and eventually, where he does the Detroit Institute of the Art Murals, and then they go to New York. By the time they get to New York, Frida is very tired. She's lost a child. She's lost a pregnancy. She's desperate, and she hates New York. She hates it. And while Diego Rivera is painting the Rockefeller murals, she makes a mistake. After what he does, he says, I want to paint the portrait of Lenin on the mural. And she says, well, why don't you? And he does. And of course, Rockefeller comes every day to see how the mural was progressing. And he notices the portrait of Lenin, and he says, that is not in the original drawings. You need to remove it. And Diego says, well, I'll put Abraham Lincoln next to him. And he says, no, that was not part of our contract. You need to remove it. And what Frida tells him, he said, don't remove it. Just finish the mural like that. You know the way Americans are. They are respectful. They're not going to vandalize your mural. So they're not going to do anything. And Diego refuses to remove it. And what happens? Rockefeller comes by. He locks the doors, refuses to let Frida and Diego in, and with a pickaxe, destroys the mural. So Frida's reaction to New York is what we see in front. If you notice, the church and the state are united. Here you see the Americans are so proud of facilities like the toilet, the telephone, gasoline, golf, the stock exchange, and the hungry people. These are people in line waiting to be fed because it's the Depression. And the Americans are fascinated with the superficial, with Mae West. She says, all of these represent something, then I'm going to leave my dress there. It can represent me. I don't want to be there. So they go back to Mexico. They go back to Mexico, and Diego Rivera is furious with her because she gave him the advice of not erasing Lenin. And as a form of revenge, he begins an affair with her sister. They become separated. Frida is desperate, and in 1937, she paints the portrait, her self-portrait, Memory. In Memory, she recalls the time when she passed from being a schoolgirl to becoming the wife of Diego Rivera, and she's being transverberated. What does that mean? When Frida was a child, she had her first communion, and one of the names that she took on was Carmen. Carmen, she took it because when she read about Saint Teresa, if you remember, Saint Teresa founded the Order of the Carmelites. The Carmelites walked without shoes so they could have pain at their feet, and that way remember the pain that Christ had. And Frida, having pain in her foot, identified with that. Also, what canonized, the miracle that canonized Saint Teresa was the transverbration by the arrow of divine love. She has this vision in which a cherub is taking an arrow and piercing her heart, and then she's closer to God. Frida does the same, and she's paying. She says, when I was a schoolgirl, life was solid, my foot was grounded. Now that I married Diego Rivera, I'm on the ocean, unpredictable, and I only have this small sailboat to ride on. Side by side with Memory, Frida Kahlo painted the still lifes. When Frida painted self-portraits, she painted them because she wanted to tell you something that she wanted you to know, but she withheld information, needless to say. But that information comes out in the still lifes. For example, in this one, in 1949, she wrote a portrait of Diego, and she described him as a cactus fruit, as a prickly pear. Inside, he was translucent white and red, and blood red. But what does she do? She uses the blood red prickly pear, and she pierces it in the middle, like she's been pierced in the heart. This is really a portrait of Diego Rivera, because in pre-Hispanic times, the warriors that were sacrificed were compared to the prickly pears. And so she will never dare to say that it's a portrait of Diego, but in herself, she says, I'm hurting him just like he's hurting me. I'm doing to him what he did to me. They finally get back together, but this is a relationship based on power. And so in 1937, Trotsky comes to Mexico, and Frida has an affair with Trotsky. And needless to say, Diego doesn't know yet. He's bound to find out. And this is the self-portrait that she paints, and she offers herself like a gift to Trotsky. And he says, here I'm Frida Kahlo, I'm giving this to Trotsky on his birthday. And she appeared like an apparition between the curtains. At that time, André Breton was in Mexico. He came to visit Mexico, to do some lectures, and Julian Levy offered an exhibition to Frida in New York. Frida did not want to go. Breton offered her the exhibition to travel to Paris, and Frida does the self-portrait, the portrait with its squintly dog. It's a revealing self-portrait because, for several reasons. First of all, she's about to take the trip. She doesn't want to take the trip. In pre-Hispanic times, when you died, you were buried with your page dog. And when you died and arrived at heaven, he was asked, was she a good master or mistress? And if the dog says yes, you're allowed to go in. Well, Frida is going, and she's taking the dog with her because separating for her is a kind of a death. We know she's struggling because she has a marijuana cigarette in her hand, and the marriage chains around her neck, which are usually used loose. You can see it in one of the photographs in the exhibition. Here she has them tied around her neck like a noose. Marriage is like a noose around her neck. When she comes back to Mexico, Diego receives her with divorce papers. He learns from Miguel Covarrubias' wife, who was a gossip, that she had the affair with Trotsky, plus she's been having an affair with Hungarian photographer Nicholas Murai. She's with Murai in the studio, and when Diego receives her with divorce papers, she paints the two Fridas. McKinley Helm, the art historian, comes to Mexico and has tea in her house, and he's sitting in front of the painting. He says, "Tell me what the painting is about." And she says, "Well, these are the two parts of me. One of them is surviving because Diego loves her. You see, there's a miniature of Diego in her left hand. And the Frida on the left is not surviving despite the Kelly clamp that she has on her left hand, in her left hand. She's bleeding to death. If you notice, one heart is intact, the other one is damaged." Where does she get the idea? Well, the idea for the outside, she gets it from a painting by Chassériau called The Sisters, which she saw in Paris when she went to her exhibition with Breton. But the emotional content of the painting comes from another place. Diego and she had a collection of over 2,000 votive paintings. And the actual painting arises out of this double heart. On the right, you see the heart of Mary. You know this because it's got the lilies for her purity. On the left, you see the heart of Christ. You see the crown of thorns. You see the cross, and you see the injury to the heart done by the Roman soldier. In churches or in Christian shops, you can buy these stamps in which both Christ and Mary are united by these flowers. This is the mystic vintage, and the rose without thorns represents the Virgin. Now, the idea for the hearts outside, Frida took from here, in that they are together, but there's also something else that she took. If you see, Mary survives just like this Frida survives. Christ does not survive, he's killed, and the Frida on the left does not survive and dies. And just like Christ had his heart punctured, Frida's heart is punctured too. Frida often said that she was born in 1910, but she was actually born in 1907. She took 3 years of her age. You can say that she took 3 years off because she wanted to look younger. However, why did she change the day of her date? She was born on the 6th of July, and she would say she was born on the 7th. She did not want to be born on the day that the native anatomy of influence said that born on such and such deer was bad future, but she could not help it. In 1940, the year in which she and Diego Rivera are divorced, she's actually 33 years old, the age when Christ was crucified. So she paints a series of paintings as the Woman of Sorrows. Of course, she's the Woman of Sorrows with a lowercase, and her passion is with a lower p, not the Passion of Christ, which is with a capital P. Here is one of those portraits. She unfurls the crown of thorns and wears it like a necklace. Why does she have the hummingbird? Well, in pre-Hispanic times, if your lover didn't love you anymore or abandoned you, you went to the marketplace and you bought a hummingbird. You hung it over your heart, and that would make you attractive to him or to her again. Now, why does she have the monkey, and why does she have the black cat? The black cat she has because she has bad luck in her life. The monkey represents the baser forces, promiscuity, aggression, and wildness. And on her hair, she has the butterflies. As we know, the butterflies represent the spirit. So she's saying, like Christ, I was betrayed. Like Christ, I'm dying. But like Christ, I'm also going to be resurrected. The self-portrait on the left can be understood as an allegory of her life. How so? Well, once again, she painted herself lying that she was 37 years old. Here she says, here I am, Frida Kahlo, with image on the mirror. I'm 37 years old. It's the month of July of 1947, and I'm in Coyoacan, Mexico, place where I was born, which actually, she was not 37, she was 40. Frida early on decided that she was going to paint a portrait, or rather a self-portrait, about the significant landmarks of her life. Here she's painting a self-portrait when she turns 40. She looks tired, she looks haggard, and her hair is loose. It's not tied up, no ribbons, no flowers. She's wearing the long hair because, again, in Christianity, the long hair, loose hair, represents grief, represents mourning. And she's standing against a volcanic rock wall, dry. Nothing can grow next to it, but there's a burro's tail, a donkey tail, which is a succulent. These plants live for long periods of time without any water. Why? Because whenever it rains, they trap water, they hold it in indefinitely until it rains again. So Frida is saying, my life has been like the life of a succulent. I never get any love, so the little that I get whenever, I have to hold on to it because otherwise I cannot survive. Frida Kahlo lived surrounded by mirrors. Lola Alvarez Bravo, her friend photographer, took endless photographs of her, and oddly, she's always around a mirror. Frida's house had mirrors on the floor, she had mirrors on the walls, she had mirrors on the tables, she had a mirror on the canopy of her bed, and she even had a mirror in the garden. And she was asked in an interview, why do you paint so many self-portraits? And she said, I paint these self-portraits because I'm so often alone. Well, she was not really alone because there are actually thousands of photographs taken of her. So how could she be alone in her life if she had so many photographs taken? What happened was that she could not stand being by herself. That's why whenever she sat anywhere in her house, wherever she looked, she could look at herself in the mirror. She was no longer alone. As long as she was painting her self-portraits, she was no longer alone. She could sustain her sense of self as long as she was looking at her. In 1945, they begin to talk about the amputation of her leg. And she paints herself. She portrays herself in a delicate balance. She uses again one of the elements of Christ's passion, the nail. And if you notice, the ribbon goes around the nail, goes around the neck of the monkey, goes around her neck, the neck of the squintly dog, and the neck of the hunchback piece from Nayarit, which we see here. It's an interesting painting because what she's really saying about her delicate balance is, if any of these moves, whether it's the dog or the monkey, or I move, I'm choked, I will die. So I'm living in this precarious balance. And why does she choose the piece from Nayarit? Because if you notice, her right leg is missing the foot, which is the leg that is going to be amputated. And here on the image on the right, she does a self-portrait, a small drawing, in which she's saying, see the eye, you see the clock, and you see the cut off leg. And she's saying, I see it's a matter of time before my leg is amputated. And at the end of her life, she signs off with this still life. The still life was probably painted in 1952, but unfinished. And we can tell it was done in 1952 because it's not painted very well. But she decides that it's finished when she's ready to give up. And she writes, "Here's to life, Frida Kahlo, Coyoacán, 1954, Mexico." Thank you. This is my talk. So if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them for you.
If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand and we will come around with the mic.
Hello. Some of the interpretations that you spoke about, are they her interpretations? Did she write them somewhere? Like, this is what I meant in this picture, and this is what was happening to me? Or
That's a very good question. Allow me to explain. The question was, did she make the actual interpretations of her paintings? No, she did not. She did of some of them, but not of these. The reason why I offer these interpretations is because when you study the work of an artist, you notice that there are certain objects that continue, that are recurrent. And she was raised a Catholic, very Catholic, and a friend of hers, Ella Wolf, told me that Frida was very taken with Christian art. And as we know, when you're a child, you're taken by the images, and the images of the gore, the images of the blood, the images of the crucifixion. And growing up a Catholic, she went to Mass regularly. There's actually a photograph of hers with a cross. Before dying, she actually had a cross that she gave to a friend of hers. And some of the elements that she repeats in her paintings are elements that have a symbolism in Christianity. So I base my interpretations on that information. For example, when you see the portraits of Mary Magdalene, she always has her hair loose because she's grieving. For example, you know that there are the objects of Christ's passion, which are the nail, the lance, the sponge, the crown of thorns. You see what I'm saying? So she uses those elements again and again and again. So I arrive at my conclusion by interpreting the elements that she uses. And she's so consistent, it's very difficult for me to choose other things. Like, for example, there's a painting of hers called My Birth, and she's lying down, and her mother appears to be dead, and the only thing above her is a portrait of the Virgin of Sorrows, and she's stuck by daggers, and she's bleeding, and she's weeping. So the only person, supposedly, that saw her when she was born and abandoned at birth was the Virgin of Sorrows, meaning she's the only one who looked after her. So again and again, she's using elements that have to do with death, that have to do with destruction. Diego Rivera would say to her that death was her lover, was her closest companion. I hope I'm answering your question. Anybody else has other questions?
In many of her early works, her head seems to be out of proportion to the rest of her body.
I'm sorry, I'm deaf and I can't hear you.
Oh, okay. All right. In many of her early works that you've shown here, her head is out of proportion to the rest of her body, like smaller. Is there any significance to that?
Not that I'm aware of. The only painting that I'm aware of that the large head has a symbolism is a painting called My Nurse and I. And she's really referring about having grown pseudo-precociously. She's actually being breastfed as an infant, but she has the face, the head, the very large head of an adult. So she's saying, when I was a very young child, I lost my innocence and I became a grown-up very quickly. And what's interesting, going back to the question that you just posed, she finished the painting, and a year or two later, she decided that it was incomplete. And what she did is she made her hair loose. She was grieving, of course, and just like she did in the self-portrait when she was 40 years old. I hope I'm answering your question.
Which one is your favorite Frida's painting and why?
I'm sorry?
Your favorite painting from Frida and why?
Actually, my favorite painting of Frida's is in the exhibition. I didn't talk about it. I have a preference for the still lifes because having studied the paintings for so long, what I have learned is that the self-portraits are painted to have an effect on you. In other words, she's telling you what she wants you to know. And she's holding information back. But in the still lives, she puts down information that she wants to keep to herself. Like, for example, she's so scared of being aggressive with Diego Rivera, but she does a portrait of the prickly pears, and she actually describes him as a prickly pear, and she uses the one that has the blood red pierced in the heart, and then she describes him in the portrait that she does of him, the same colors as these prickly pears. And there are many references to that. Like, for example, my favorite painting has a title called Magnolias, which is from 1945, which actually is the original title is not Magnolias, it's just flowers. She painted it for the 1945 exhibition of flowers at the Benjamin Franklin Library in Mexico. And it's an interesting painting because when you look at it, it appears to be mostly or only magnolias. But when you study each of the flowers, you notice that there's only one type of magnolia, which is the one that lives the least. It's born during the day, and by the time night arrives, it's died. And Frida compared it to the youthful beauty of women, because it disappeared very quickly. And she would say, you need to have something else inside of you, because if you only have beauty, you're not going to do very well. Now, that painting she painted when Jacqueline Lamba left Mexico. Jacqueline Lamba, the wife of Breton, came to Mexico in 1944. If you notice the still life called The Bride That Becomes Frightened When She Sees Life Open, there's a small doll on the upper corner, and she's looking at all this aggressively cut fruit. And actually, that's a portrait of Jacqueline Lamba. There's actually a photograph of hers wearing the same dress, the same haircut, etc. And the hairdo, sorry. And Frida painted that portrait because the portrait of Jacqueline, that still life, because Jacqueline wrote to her. She was in New York. She wanted to leave Breton. She had a lover, but she was afraid of leaving him because she was protected under the umbrella of Breton's power. She did not know what to do if she went on her own. Now, I say this because Jacqueline and her daughter Aube came to Mexico in 1944. And Jacqueline and Frida painted 3 paintings that have to do with Jacqueline. The one that I mentioned just a minute ago, The Bride Who Becomes Frightened When She Sees Life Open. The second one is a portrait of her genitals. You see, but she paints it like a mandrake plant. She inverts it. She has the fallopian tubes, but it's missing the ovaries. And then it's missing the uterus. Inside, there's a penis that is ejaculating. And she's saying, I am not a complete woman. I cannot have children, and I've served only as to provide pleasure for men, and I myself don't derive pleasure. That's the second portrait, and that one reason why she painted it is because Jacqueline came with her daughter, and Frida fell in love with Aube, with her daughter, and kept her all these months. And when Jacqueline was going out and doing things, Frida kept Jacqueline. There's a long, long interview with Aube in which she talks about how she would crawl in bed with Frida, they would play with the dogs, Frida would read to her. She was a little bitty thing. And anyway, that's the second still life. The third one, she paints when Jacqueline leaves. And the funny thing is that Jacqueline leaves toward the end of the year when the magnolia tree is beginning to wither. And there's a photograph taken in the Blue House in which Jacqueline is holding a magnolia, and she's smelling it. Out of that comes the painting, quote, Magnolias, which is a title given to it later. The reason why Frida called it flower, if you pay closer attention, all the still lifes are allegories, and they're allegories, they tell a narrative. In Magnolias, you see the actual magnolia that dies at the end of the day, but there are two other flowers. One of them, hardly hidden, is a calla lily, and we know that calla lily is Diego Rivera's favorite flower. That's whenever he painted women, he liked to paint calla lilies with them. So that calla lily represents Diego. And the painting at the very front of and the flower at the very front of the painting is actually a cactus flower. It's an interesting flower because Frida played with the size. Instead of it being small, like it usually is, it's very large to the size of the magnolias. And the interesting thing about this flower is that anytime you cut a flower from a cactus, it immediately dies. It cannot live separated from the main plant, which is Frida talking about her own separation anxiety. The other thing that, in my opinion, confirms that it's a portrait of Frida is if you look at the stems, the genitals are damaged. There's one that is damaged. So what she's really saying in this allegory, she's saying Diego Rivera surrounded by all these beautiful women and a defective one. I hope I'm answering your question. Other questions?
Based on your experience as a clinical psychologist,
I'm sorry, I don't what did you say?
Based on your experience as a clinical psychologist, at least from what I understood, what do you think was the psychological tendency that led Frida to come back to Diego, even though it was a toxic relationship?
Well, I tried to explain earlier that because she had a deficit bonding experience, it left her a pre-verbal experience on which she built the rest of her life. She was always insecure. She was always afraid of being left alone. In her letters, she repeatedly says, "Don't forget me," and she paints these self-portraits that she oftentimes gives to people so they will think of her. When she does the self-portrait that she dedicates for her boyfriend, she says, "Hang it low so we can be together, so you can look at it." There's a self-portrait that belongs to the Museum of Modern Art, New York, called Furan Chang and myself, in which she's with her monkey. And she gave it to a friend, and together with that painting, she gave her a mirror. She says, "Hang it next to it. That way, when you come to look at the painting, you can stand in front of the mirror and we can be together." The other thing that you need to remember, that she is never with a person in the paintings, except with this commissioned marriage portrait. But she's always in the company of an animal, or she has a cigarette, which means that she needs to be nourished, she needs to be nourified. And of course, the cigarette is really a pacifier. I hope I'm answering your question. Anybody else has questions?
Yeah, we have time for one more question, and then we'll do the raffle. Could you explain a little bit on why did she choose to wear traditional Mexican clothing?
Yes. When Diego Rivera arrived in Mexico from Paris, he was painting paintings influence from his stay, from the 10 years that he stayed in Europe. And he met Adolfo Besmogard, who was an intellectual, and he was a very well-educated man who understood what Mexican Revolution was really about. Mexicans were tired of foreign influences, so they wanted to bring back what was the original art of Mexico. But Bess Bogart said that the real art, the one that had never been influenced by Europe, was the art that was made by the people. And he took Diego Rivera to Oaxaca, to Tehuantepec, to show him that these people had never been influenced by Europe. They wore their traditional costumes. And also that Diego discovered is that the women of Tehuantepec, it was really a matriarchy. They were the boss. If you were the child of this couple, they wouldn't say, oh, he's the son of this man. No, no, no. He's the son of this woman. She was the boss over, and it did not really matter who your husband was. What mattered is you as the mother of the child. So when Diego Rivera came back, he said to Frida, I want you to wear these clothes because they're the clothes that independent women wore that were not influenced. And of course, people came to Mexico. Mexicans wore the usual garb that they wore, like everybody's wearing today. However, by wearing this dress, she was making a statement. What many people don't really know is that she was not the only one that was dressed like that. There were many, for example, Olga Tamayo wore it, and other painters, other women. It was not uncommon for them to be dressed like this. What made a difference is that Frida was spectacular, and these women were not. Anybody else?